Got Eric from the Center for Open Science.
Cool. Thank you, Taylor. And couldn't have a better lead in than Top's talking about the importance of open science, and also Rachel this morning demonstrating how the USPD project is leveraging the OSF, which I'll touch on here, but really want to talk a little bit about where that OSF infrastructure comes from and why we prioritize that work at the Center for Open Science. So I like this slide here, not to focus on any one particular story, but rather that there are lots of stories like this where, and actually some very, very newsworthy ones over the last year or so, where years and years of research in a particular area turns out that there were foundational issues with the data provided, and people whole careers were built on data that was either poorly developed and maintained, or just flat out maliciously faked, which does a lot of damage to not just individual researchers, but the whole fields really get derailed by practices like this. And mostly it's not maliciously and intentionally done, but it happens all the same. And so how do we prevent some of these crises of reproducibility and replication? And just to demonstrate one little piece of this, is a study here from Nature, where this idea of, yeah, you can have the data if you ask for it, rather than it being a practice to actually require your data to be included with your cited in your manuscript or included with your manuscript. So sure, yeah, just say that it'll be available. And so you had 1,800 manuscripts that said, yeah, sure, you can reach out to me. And then almost 1,700 of those never responded to a request for that same data. And so only a handful provided the data that they said would be available. So without that data or other materials, all I have is the manuscript. So in order to chase down what the findings and being able to replicate that study, I have very limited access to what I need in order to do that as a researcher. And so the source of that problem here is really that the incentives for success for individual researchers, and priority one for researchers is often that they get to continue to do their research and build on their career. Right now, their incentives are getting published and not necessarily getting it right. And so to visualize a little bit of that, right now, the incentive is have something novel and positive with tidy outcomes. You could put in a manuscript because publishers like to gravitate toward those results, and you're more likely to get published. But the fallout of that is you end up with some selective reporting on the individual's part, minimal transparency where the data and other code and material software isn't shared. There's not a process where correction is happening along the way, because I don't have to talk about how I got to where I ended up. I just have the manuscript at the end. So at the end of the day, we have lots of missing pieces for me to be able to replicate your research and then be able to build on it toward more findings. So one other way to look at this is actually, instead of incentivizing just one tidy published result, we actually incentivize rigor and high quality and transparency across not just one manuscript at the end, but actually the whole life cycle of a research project. So have complete reporting that's not just one manuscript, but reporting your practices from the beginning, from planning through your implementation, and including as many of the pieces of your research project as is responsible: data, code, materials, supplements, software, and references to things that you can't include, so that if someone wants to build on your research, they have all of the elements that they need to do so. So it's the Center for Open Science, or COS. Our goal is to enable that. And I'm going to tell you to give you the picture of how we do that. But really, we have three pillars in our organization to sort of work toward this vision of more transparency and openness in science. So we have a policy team that works with publishers and funders and other institutions to incentivize and embrace changes like the ones we just heard about from TOPS. A research team that is researching research. So they call it meta science, which is looking and demonstrating the evidence of this change or the need for that change. And then infrastructure, where I'm coming from, which is building technology that's going to enable these changes in the first place. So we like to talk about the diffusion of innovations here, and we use some similar terminologies we just saw in the TOPS presentation, where there's always innovators and people that are just really excited to try these new things. They're going to be way out front of others in their disciplinary community or other communities, and they're willing to try lots of cool practices that maybe others in their communities aren't quite ready for. And then as we make those processes easier and more incentivized, as we talked about before, we get more and more members of those communities willing to join. They're seeing demonstrated success. It's easier for them to grab onto those processes and try them themselves. And then eventually you get even the laggards that aren't so interested in trying those things, but now the community is pulling them forward by making those highly encouraged or even required to participate in those research practices. And so there's a few pieces that go into moving communities across those the diffusion there. So can I demonstrate that there is an advantage for you as a researcher for trying these practices? Is it even somewhat compatible to the practices you have now? Is it overly complex so much that you're not willing to try it? Do you have an ability to just try things out without, becoming overly committed? And then can you observe that the things that you've done are actually providing useful benefits for your community and for yourself as a researcher? So if you can account for those factors, then you can start moving people across that diffusion. So the way that we look at this at COS is this pyramid of our theory of change, where we can move communities across that diffusion if, at the very foundation, we make it possible in the first place. So if we think there's a practice that is really exciting, really has a potential of opening up science, if it's not possible, if they don't even have the tools to do it, then people aren't going to be on board. Even the innovators aren't going to try something that they don't even have the pieces to attempt. So it's just make it possible for them to try these innovative practices. And then if those catch on and we see that there's benefit there, then we continue to make it easy. So both of those steps are where I live here at COS, where we build technology and then work with communities, building toward what their needs are, so that it gets easier and easier for them to participate in open and transparent practices. And then communities start to take over, and the tools are just assets that they use, and it just becomes a norm. It's an accepted norm in their community to participate in those practices. So data sharing is one in earth science. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have had that same expectation of citing your data as its own object in your paper, but now there's a lot of activity behind that. So it's a normative practice, and making it rewarding so that I'm incentivized to do it, not just because it's a good practice, but because I get citations for now my data set in addition to my paper, and I'm visible in more ways, and things are connected to my research in more ways. There's an incentive for me to do that. And then if all of that didn't get my attention and force me into trying these practices or encourage me to do it, then making it required will. So if I can't get my grant without committing to data sharing and getting a renewal based on sharing my outcome reports, then that's a requirement that I have to meet in order to continue my research. So that's going to get everybody moving forward if it gets to that level. So we see it narrow down as we get to that point. And just to give you a couple of examples here in the geosciences community, when we talk about making things possible and easier, having enhanced and consistent metadata and persistent identifiers to improve preservation and discovery across the discipline, and having standards across many of the stakeholders like publishers, funders, institutions, repositories in the discipline helps a lot there. Continuing to make it easier and normative through education. We had a great example with the TOPS work there. being able to demonstrate a real value of making your data and other objects open is incredibly important to getting communities on board with this with any of these practices as valuable. And then you can get all the way to that point where it becomes an expectation and a standard and a requirement like the ones that OGC talked a little bit about. I have an example here that I worked on some years ago with the Enabling Fair Data in Earth Science initiative, which was really a very successful implementation of this idea of getting all the stakeholders around the table, publishers, funders, repositories, and institutions and infrastructure like myself to come up with some of these things they can all agree on and standardize. And so on the technology side, what we do at COS is the OSF, which Rachel is probably the best testimony I can give you is just to point to her presentation as a great use case of OSF. And the idea of OSF is it is a generalist repository like Zenodo that we just heard about. But what it's trying to do is provide tools for researchers to support them across the entire life cycle of their research project. So not just sharing an outcome at the very end with a paper, but rather they can do their planning. You could plan your entire analysis and get a time-stamped document for your analysis plan on the OSF. It's a process we call pre-registration that some disciplines are very heavily into. Others, still working in that direction. But you can do your collaboration and collecting all of your documents and code and dependencies on the OSF, and then you can share with preprints or archive data on the OSF as well. And then we have a full suite of discovery features so that people can find all of those things that you've just shared on the OSF. So all of those pieces without leaving the platform you can do. And then we have interoperability with storage providers, with citation managers, with computing tools, so that you can even integrate your other tools and workflows that you have into the OSF and collaborate with your peers with those. That is a place where we're trying to move even further into and have interoperability with more tools, as Rachel alluded to earlier. So I'm really be very interested to talk with anybody about potential collaborations there. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by the connections we try to enable on the OSF's little crude animation here, but when a researcher submits their work on the OSF, we're capturing things from them as a user, including their ORCID ID, which is an identifier for a person. I even wore my ORCID socks for you today, just to emphasize how important those things are. We capture a ROR ID. A ROR ID is a research organization registry identifier, so it's for organizations, for places. So we'll get that from the researcher too, and then they'll put all their content in, if it's a data set or a preprint or other materials, any of that they could put on the OSF. They give us relationships to other data sets and materials and papers. They could put DOIs for all of that into their content. We package it all up. We send it to DataCite and mint a DOI for them. And now all of those relationships are discoverable when their institutions or funders or other researchers query that their research institution, that person based on their ORCID ID, the funding organization, if the user concluded that metadata, all of that now can be used to discover that particular piece of content. So lots of relationships that we get to enable through persistent identifiers, which we think is a really exciting and added benefit of using a platform like OSF. There are many platforms that will do some of these pieces, but to be able to enable this across the research lifecycle is really where we live on the OSF and at the Center for Open Science. So with that, I will wrap up and thank you for having me. Well, I used to work at ORCID, so I had an advantage there. So I have a handful of ORCID swag that maybe is not publicly available. Yeah.
Researcher